organizers, we would like to thank our moderator, keynote speaker, and panelists who have joined us for this session. And thank you to all the participants for being with us here. In today's webinar, the speakers will be delving into a topic that is very important to South Asia, the issue of labor migration and remittances. This session will focus on the issues like joblessness among returnee migrants and mechanisms to address the predicament, among other issues. We hope to have an interesting and insightful discussion today. Regarding the time, I request you all to be considerate and we'll be also helping you track the time. We would also like to have a vibrant discussion through the active participation of the audience, and hence I request the participants to write their questions and comments in the chat box, which will be addressed by the speakers after the individual deliberations are over. If time allows, we'll also have a short question and answer session with the participants. Before handing over the session to the moderator, let me quickly introduce the moderator of this webinar, Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri. Dr. Suleri has been leading Sustainable Development Policy Institute, STPI, a leading think tank in Pakistan since 2007, and is currently serving in the Pakistan's Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So without further ado, we would like to get the meeting started, and I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Suleri. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shajis, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Though most of you who have joined us on Zoom and those of you who are watching it on live stream, on custom live stream. First of all, on behalf of all the co-organizers of this meeting, STPI, IPS, RIS, and CPD in Bangladesh and Sochi in Nepal, let me welcome you all. And today's topic is extremely important as we are going to discuss impact of COVID on one of the major pillars of our GDP and of our economy. And I'm talking of remittances, and I'm talking of not only the dollars that flow in to our countries, but also the human resources that get absorbed in the destination countries, in the host countries. So we are discussing how this pandemic, it might have affected the job provision in destination countries. How is it affecting the remittances? And what is it that the host governments, the sending governments, they can do differently to provide social security and social protection to the very productive diaspora who were one of the sources of our foreign exchange reserves. We have lined up very eminent panel of speakers with us. The keynote speaker, Dr. Professor Ravi Srivastava, is professor and director at Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. Professor Srivastava is a former professor and chairperson, Center for Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and currently director, Center for Employment Studies. He has published 5 books and over 120 research papers, considered as one of the authority on human development and employment. And he has worked extensively on labor, employment, and migrant issues. After his keynote address, we have 3 speakers. I have Dr. Radhika Kapoor, who is fellow Indian Council for Research and International Economic Relations, ICRIER. She is a senior fellow, and prior to joining ICRIER, she worked at the Planning Commission and at ILO. Her broad areas of research interest include poverty and inequality, labor economics, and industrial performance. She holds a PhD in economics from LSE. And then I have Dr. Balisha Veeraratne, who is research fellow and head of migration and urbanization research institute of policy studies of Sri Lanka, Colombo. She has a PhD in economics from City University of New York and postdoctoral training from Princeton University, New Jersey. Her areas of research interest include internal and international migration and urbanization. And last but not least, Dr. Paras Kharal, he will be representing the organization, the host organization, SOTI. He is research director here, and he has a PhD in economics from University of Melbourne, and his research interests include international trade and migration remittances. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before I give the floor to Professor Srivastava, I would say that in case of Pakistan, we have seen two types of impacts which were slightly, we were not predicting it like that. The one was that in the months preceding COVID, our remittances flow, it has actually increased. So on month to on year basis, when we compare the remittances received in September, in August, in July, so actually we saw an increase in those remittances rather than a drop in the remittances. And perhaps one way of explaining it can be that those who are sitting in Middle East or in other parts of the world, because it's time of crisis, so perhaps they're sending more money, more one-off cash to the dependent families back home, and that may be a reason that there is an increase in remittances. Second, the government of Pakistan has come up with a very innovative scheme for Pakistan, and that is that all the returning migrants, overseas workers who are coming back, they can get themselves registered on a portal, on a Prime Minister portal, and then our Ministry for Overseas Pakistanis and Human Resource Development, they try to match their expertise for local job provision. And those who would like to go on social protection once they come back, our EHSAS program, EHSAS is in Urdu or Hindi word, compassionate. So EHSAS program under Benazir Income Support Program, they will get a one-off payment of rupees 12,000, which may be a very tiny amount, but it would help them in at least settling down with their families. So these are some of the ways government of Pakistan is trying to appreciate and acknowledge all the contributions of their overseas citizens. And I look forward to listen from the experience of our other South Asian neighbors. But before that, I hand over the floor to Professor Srivastava. Over to you, Professor sir.
Thank you, Dr. Suleri. Thank you, Soti, for inviting me and co-panelists. I think everything about this pandemic is something unexpected. Most of us did not expect the pandemic to last as long as it has. And I think globally, the response to a pandemic was in the form of the kind of stringent response that we saw to the pandemic everywhere in the world, which has extended not only for a few weeks, but for a very extended period, has really affected the economy in a way that I don't think it was expected. As you can see, that globally, with every forecast, the World Bank has made 2 forecasts. The second forecast was much worse than the first. The IMF has made 2 forecasts. The second was much worse than the first. So every successive forecast that has been made of the impact of the pandemic on the global economy is in fact predicting a worse outcome than the first one. The stringency of the lockdowns we have seen not only in South Asian countries, but in most of the destination countries, the Gulf countries, Malaysia, Singapore, and elsewhere, has been extremely harsh. And the first set of people to be impacted by the lockdown and the stringency has been those who have been in precarious employment. And it is the migrants, low-skilled migrants in precarious employment in the destination countries who have been extremely severely impacted. As far as the South Asian countries are concerned, they have been on a rising curve in terms of the number of migrant workers abroad. Of course, the major destination for South Asia continues to be the Gulf countries, and that is also the largest source of remittances for us. The Gulf countries have been impacted. It has been a double whammy as far as the impact of the pandemic is concerned. On the one hand, the Gulf countries have been impacted by the pandemic and the economic crisis which has ensued. On the other hand, the fall in the oil prices. And this is also true for the other oil exporting countries such as Malaysia. So the economic crisis that we see and the impact on the migrants is a result of both the downward spiral in the oil prices as well as the economic crisis due to the pandemic. And it has come as no great surprise that the migrants in the destination countries have been hugely impacted, have been wanting to, many have been left without jobs. There has been a response which I would say, in direct opposed to the kind of humanitarian response we would expect in many of the destination countries. In some destination countries, there has been a tendency to put the migrants together in camps, to extend the quarantine periods for them. In other destination countries, in some destination countries, migrants have even been huddled into prisons. There have been a large number of reports from South Asian countries, from India, from Pakistan, or Bangladesh, of wages not being paid to migrants. Of course, many migrants have been stranded, and I will not speak here of the refugees not being able to return to their countries of origin because of the lack of transport, lack of air transport. The fact that they have been, their employment has been terminated, and that they pay several months actually in covering their recruitment costs, and then many of them have had to pay for their journey back to their home countries, meant that they are that they have not been able to repay the debts which they normally incur in going abroad, and they're in greater debts today than they were at the beginning of this whole process of emigration. At this moment, we don't have firm numbers of the numbers of people who have returned to the home countries. But India, the approximate numbers as far as India is concerned is about 1.3 million. I think South Asia as a whole has received probably more than 2 million return migrants from various destination countries. Of course, the number of migrant workers could be lesser because the numbers that we have are not only of migrant workers but also accompanying people with them, the non-workers included. In a crisis of this kind, the normal expectation is that maybe 15 to 20% of the stock of migrants which is abroad would return. At the moment, the numbers are lower than that. And this could be because there are not too many flights from the destination countries. So that we do still have stranded workers abroad and their family members abroad. Therefore, as flights open up and the number of flights increases, it is likely that those who are stranded abroad will continue to return to their home countries. Some of the countries, and we heard about Pakistan from Dr. Suleri, have specific programs for the migrant workers. But in general, there is an attempt to integrate them with the overall programs that are already there in source countries. India, for example, has no specific programs, although Kerala is trying to, as usual, Kerala is ahead of other states. And Kerala is trying to do something for return migrants who are working, who are returning under these conditions. But at the moment, we don't have specific social protection programs addressed to migrants. The question is really that as far as future prospects are concerned, the destination countries, if you look at the growth prospects globally as well as in the destination countries, they are for example, if you look at South Asian countries, and if you look at the growth prospects, I'm quoting here the OECD figures because these are the most recent figures. From among the international organizations, they were given out in August. Then South Asia is expected to grow at a negative minus 8.2% in 2020 and at minus 3.1% in 2021. The commodity producing emerging economies, developing economies at minus 7.2% and minus 2% the next year. India, the projections are minus 9% in 2020 and minus 3% in 2021. Pakistan minus 5 and minus 3.2%. Bangladesh minus 5.3 and minus 5.6%. This is as far as the source countries is concerned. But even if you look at, as I said, the EMDs, the emerging, the commodity exporting EMDs, even there, the growth rates are minus 7.2% and 0.2%. So at the end of 2021, none of these countries or regions would have growth levels which would be even at the levels at which they were at the beginning of the pandemic. So this is the kind of, and so it would take some years, I think 2 to 3 years. This is really the most severe economic crisis. In fact, a global group today or yesterday predicted that this is the most severe global crisis in the last century. So in the recent future, maybe 2 to 3 years, certainly, and going forward also, if there are shifts in the demand curve for labor, the migrant labor, the future prospects for emigration abroad are going to be much lower than in the past. Of course, we do have the experience of the 2008-9 crisis, where the recovery was strong enough as far as immigration was concerned. Within a year, immigration rates actually bounced back, and so did remittances. But most predictions, with the World Bank predictions made by Nomad, if you look at Asia Development Bank predictions, which are more recent in August, if you look at ADB predictions, for example, they predict that remittances, and there are the three kinds of baseline and then extreme predictions with the ADB, the median and the extreme predictions which ADB has made. And under those projections, in the South Asian decline in remittances is likely to be much higher than global decline. In the baseline scenarios, the global decline is projected at minus 9%. In South Asia, for about minus 16%. In the extreme scenario, the global decline is minus 18.7%. South Asia, it is predicted to be minus 24.7%. So the global decline, the South Asian decline in remittances is predicted to be, is forecast to be much higher than the global decline. And if you look at, again, the South Asian economies, Nepal is expected to have the sharpest decline in global remittances, followed by Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. And Sri Lanka will have a much more moderate decline in remittances compared to the other countries. However, as Dr. Suleri pointed out, actually, the actual performance of remittances, we don't have hard figures at the time being, but the actual performance of the remittances in June and July, or up to July, has not been as poor. In fact, many countries have seen a hump in remittances. This includes Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. I don't have the provisional figures for Sri Lanka. And this seems to be for two reasons. One reason is what Dr. Suleri has already given us, which is that people who are in more stable employment in these countries, the stock of immigrants is sending more money back to the home countries because of the crisis. And also the people who are remitting more money because they are returning their entire savings which they can afford to remit. So this is one set of explanations. The other set of explanations which has also been offered is that the informal channels, which normally remittances go through the fair amount of remittances go through the informal channels, and the demand for hawala transactions has gone down in the destination countries. So more remittances are moving back through formal channels. And this is also leading to the hump in the remittances that we are seeing. I'm not quite sure which of these is correct, but these are the two broad explanations which are currently being given. However, we do expect a decline in remittances to happen over the over the entire year and to persist for some period of time. Now, as far as migrants is concerned, there is a whole range of problems with which migrants are facing, which has been analyzed through their experiences. I've already referred to the debts, their living conditions, their employment is a major issue. The question of being able to find them, because if they're not going to find employment and they're not being able to, will not be able to re-emigrate to their former destinations, then they will have to find employment in the home countries. And really, this question of employment is not only restricted to migrants returning abroad, but it is there for a whole set of people who have been in precarious employment in the home countries. And the question of absorbing them really depends upon the kind of policies which countries in the South Asian region are following. The fiscal stimulus which they're able to give, the policies that they are having, they're being able to have in order to regenerate employment. I will not say more about India because we will have a separate presentation. Radhika will be giving a separate presentation on India. But certainly many countries are not being able to do enough. And there will be a serious question of whether we are able to actually even restore the levels of it. It will take us, I think, in India and in most South Asian countries, it will be some years before we are able to resume the levels of employment that we had before the lockdown. And in order to be able to do that, we will require very concerted macroeconomic efforts and also efforts which are, for example, in India, as urban migrants, and you've heard about the internal migrant crisis in India, have returned to the rural areas. And many of the migrants abroad are also people who live in rural areas and not in urban areas. We need concerted policies to regenerate employment in rural areas, which for a long period of time had suffered from a neglect of such policies. So not only do we need overall macroeconomic policies to stimulate employment, we also need effort to regenerate agriculture and to regenerate employment in rural areas as a whole. We also need to make more, give more money in the hands of the unemployed and the poor people. So social protection policies and policies which can transfer income to the poor have to be, we have to be looked at more carefully. I don't think we've heard of the Banerjee program. Dr. Suleri has mentioned it, but I think countries need to have more extensive social protection programs across the region. So going forward, let me end here because time is short. Maybe we can come back with questions. We are facing the most serious economic crisis that we have ever faced in our lifetimes. This crisis in the months to come will pan out depending on the course of the pandemic, which of course continues to be an unknown feature at the moment. In India, we believe that the first peak has been crossed, just about crossed, but we don't know. So we don't even know that because we were at some point of time at about 97,000 cases per day, new cases per day. Presently, we are about 75 to 80,000 new cases per day. So it is possible that the first peak has been crossed, but we cannot be too sure about that either in this part of the world or in any other part of the world as of now. And that is also entangled with the whole process of economic recovery. So the economic recovery at the moment is very, very uncertain. It will take a long period of time, and countries in the region have to be very proactive. The governments will have to be very proactive to minimize the negative effects of the pandemic, particularly on the poor and the vulnerable. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, Dr. Suleri.
Thank you very much, Professor Srivastava, and especially highlighting the need for a more comprehensive universal social safety net, social protection program for those migrants, and also for highlighting the case of internal migration, which of course is as important as the remittances from abroad. We'll take some question answers, but before that, let me come to the other speakers. We have with us Dr. Radhika Kapoor, fellow of ICRIER. Over to you, Radhika ji.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Soti, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. The pandemic has hit developing countries with special force for a variety of reasons. Low fiscal resources, limited public health resources, and precarious nature of labor markets. And there's a very real possibility that the gains that we have made in economic development over the years may in fact be undone. So it's really important that we have this discussion at the forum that we are having it at, and Professor Srivastav has given us a very clear overarching picture of the challenges that we face in the South Asia context, in particular with a view to migration and labor remittances. It's particularly appropriate in the conversation about how these countries have witnessed growth over the years, what is explained, because remittances are a vital source of income for developing countries. They enable families to afford food, healthcare, their very basic needs. So the decline in remittances, which we can expect to see in the future, some of which might not be evident in the data at this point, is a matter of serious concern. Now, Professor Srivastav has spoken about both international and internal migration. And I would like to begin by focusing more on internal migration, because my points are largely in the Indian context. And as you all know, India, you would have witnessed in pictures and news the unprecedented plight of Indian migrants, hungry, helpless migrants who have walked hundreds of kilometers to get back home when there was a nationwide lockdown, a lockdown which was in fact ranked as one of the most stringent in the world, that was announced at a 4-hour notice. Now, we all know that workers in the informal sector have borne a disproportionate burden of both the COVID-19 shock and the lockdown shock. I mean, these two shocks have happened concomitantly. The latter, of course, is a function of the containment policies that we have adopted. And even amongst informal workers, it would be fair to say that migrant labor has been hit the hardest, because they have found themselves not just without a job and income, but also accommodation or shelter. And we don't have official estimates of the number of migrants who actually went back to their villages on foot or through the special migrant train services, though those estimates could lie anywhere between 30 to 50 million. But we know that there has been a massive exodus of migrant labor from the cities. Now, to understand why is it that there was this exodus that happened, it kind of requires us to understand the nature of migration that is there in India. And Professor Srivastav, in fact, has done some seminal work. So I'm going to draw on some of his work in the Indian context to understand why we witnessed the sort of exodus that we did. And I'll try to do this as briefly because I also want to talk a bit about international migration. So, basically migration, the type of migrants you could either have, permanent migrants. So these are those people who have located permanently to the city and really don't have a strong link with the areas that they come from. Or you've got semi-permanent or long-term circular migrants, or you have short-term, short-duration circular migrants, or what are called seasonal migrants. Now, this exodus of migrant labor that we have witnessed has largely been in the category of the last two workers. These are people who are in vulnerable terms of employment, precarious terms, in low-paying work, and these were the people who were basically felt the first effects of the lockdown shock and the pandemic shock. Now, these are people who are principally employed either as casual workers or regular informal workers or small sorts of self-employed workers. And both circular migration and informality, again, as Professor Srivastav has pointed out in his work, are very closely intertwined in the Indian context. Over the years, we've seen increasing informal employment in India for a variety of reasons. It might be because of labor regulations or because of firms trying to become more competitive and reduce social security costs. But we have seen increasing informal employment and more low-paying work. And what has happened as a consequence of that low-paying work is that very often migrants and their families are compelled to draw on some sort of income from rural areas. and they cannot survive simply on what they earn on urban areas. So they have to have one foothold in the rural areas as well. So this growth of low-paying, informal employment in urban areas has actually moved concomitantly in tandem with this phenomena of circular migration. So given that these people have very low paying work, they often live in adverse accommodation arrangements, they might be even living on work sites. When the lockdown was announced, they were pushed back, they were compelled to go back to their villages. And there are several reports, in particular, somebody is interested in looking at the Indian case. There are these wonderful reports by the Swan Network, which have very carefully documented the sort of challenges that the internal migrants face. And what comes across through these reports is that at each stage, the migrants have faced a different set of challenges and their problems have only exacerbated. In the first stage, when the lockdown was announced, they didn't have enough food, they didn't have cash, they didn't know how to get home. Then the government announced these special migrant train services, but then there were conflicting informations and circulars coming out. So there was a lot of confusion about how migrants were going to come back home. And now when they have in fact reached home, the question is, what is it that they're going to do? Of course, agriculture is an employer of last resort. So we can expect to see a lot of these people being drawn into agriculture, but that just means that there's going to be greater underemployment in the agricultural sector. Many of you would know of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which is a public works program that offers employment for up to 100 days to a rural household. So a lot of migrants are likely to have, we don't know the exact numbers about how many migrants took jobs under MG Narega, but we do know that there's been a huge uptick in employment under MG Narega. And so that has been likely to generate employment for these people. But what is now worrying is that over time, as funds are drying up in this public work program, as households are gradually reaching their threshold of 100 work days under this program, people are running out of work opportunities in rural areas. This is both in the rural agricultural and the rural non-agricultural sector. What is also happening is that a lot of these people who were initially working in the cities and sending remittances back home are no longer being able to do so, because when they've come back to their villages, the sort of work that they're engaged in is even more low paying than what they got in urban areas. If you look at, for example, again, the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Program, the wages which are offered in this program are lower than state minimum wages also. And this could be anywhere, 2 to 30% below what are state minimum wages. So clearly people are earning a lot less than before, and this will have an impact on the rural economy. Now, some of this, we don't actually have very contemporary data on domestic remittances, but just to give you a sense, the National Sample Survey for the data between 2007 and 2008 tells us that internal remittances amounted to about $10 billion US. And these domestic transfers financed over 30% of all household consumption in the remittance receiving households. And there was another study by the RBI in 2018 which said that almost 3/5 of remittances received by households were for family maintenance purposes. So such a substantial fall in remittances to rural areas is likely to push many of the families deeper into poverty. They will have to cut back expenditure on a lot of essential items, including sending their children to school. In fact, it's likely to push many of them to make force their children into child labor. So the impact of the decline in remittances on the local economy are indeed substantial. And of course, the question that is there is that what are these people going to do going ahead? As Professor Srivastava said, we need to think of what is the enabling macroeconomic framework that we require to accelerate the pace of job creation, to in particular drive growth in the rural economy, which is where now most people have been pushed back into, because it's not really very clear if these people are going to want to move back into the city. The circumstances in which they had to leave urban areas has in fact left them quite scarred. So we don't know if they're going to want to come back. And if they're not, then this is likely to depress wages and push the rural economy further and aggravate the agrarian distress. The other thing that we've been talking about in the Indian context is actually an urban employment guarantee program. And the contours of this haven't been worked out. But if this were to be put in place, and and if it were to be available to even the urban migrants, I mean, we don't know how the details of the program yet, that could be one sort of safety net that would be available to the urban poor. Okay, so I have just a minute. So I've spoken about internal migration, but just to say briefly that international migration is extremely important as well in the Indian context. In 2019, actually, the amount of remittances which came into India were $83 billion, and this actually exceeded the total foreign direct investment into India in 2019-20, and that was $73 billion. So the huge decline that we're going to see in international remittances is also going to have an impact. We're already seeing it in the state of Kerala, which sends one of the largest number of international migrants. It's about 2.5 million, and 400,000 of these have already come back to the state. And last year, Kerala received $15 billion in remittances, and this is accounted for about a tenth of the state's entire economic output. So the fact that a lot of the migrants are coming back, and as Professor Srivastav said, the migrants who are actually bearing a disproportionate burden of this crisis, be it the internal migrants or the international migrants, are basically the low-skilled or the semi-skilled migrants. And this, of course, is deeply worrying because they are coming back to a situation where already there is very high unemployment. There are limited avenues of employment which are available. So we don't know how we are going to grapple with this situation. And what makes things worse is that many countries are now closing borders, and they are saying that they're going to close the labor market and reserve jobs for locals. Forget countries. We're even seeing this in the states of India, where some states are reserving jobs for local. So the need for international cooperation as well as cooperation across states also becomes very important going ahead if we have to tackle this issue. And just to say in conclusion that I think that for the migrants, there's really devastation on both sides, be it the host country or be it the home country. And as we try to chart a way out for them in terms of policy recommendations, it's important that we don't treat them as objects of charity, but we have to recognize the important role that they play in contributing to the growth of, be it the host state or the host country that they go to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radhika. We truly blessed both the speakers. They remained within their allocated time. Very rare nowadays. And Dr. Radhika, she highlighted again the importance of internal migrants and the responsibilities of both home states as well as the host states. Our next speaker will give us the perspective from Sri Lanka, Dr. Belisha Veeraratne from IPS. The floor is yours, Dr. Belisha.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak here today. So as we all agree, labor migration and remittances are important to the South Asian region. And like our honorable speaker, honorable keynote speaker mentioned, the pandemic is unexpected. But I would like to start off saying that even though the pandemic is unexpected, what the migrant workers were going to go through was kind of expected, because this was happening for a long time. The conditions of migrant workers were in such a state that we knew if something like this was to happen, migrant workers were going to suffer a lot. So I want to focus on two key areas of labor migration, specifically international labor migration from South Asian region. One is the destination of the majority of South Asian labor migrants, and the other is the skills. So if you look at the destination, we see there is a huge number of migrant workers from the South Asian region heading to the Middle East region. When you take as a percentage of annual departures in 2019 figures, I think about 95% of departures from Pakistan was to the Middle East region. And from India, it was about 93%, and from Sri Lanka, it was about 85%. So I will get to why I picked this destination-specific context after I speak about the skills issue. So when we look at the skills distribution of migrant workers from the South Asian region, also we see a specific characteristic. We see that a large portion of annual departures from the South Asian region are of migrant workers of the lower end of the skills distribution. That's like unskilled or semi-skilled workers. So the problem here is this has not happened now in 2019. It has been going on for a couple of years, over so many years, that this destination and skills mix has been coming together. This combination is kind of very, how would I say, this combination of destination and skills makes it very vulnerable for migrant workers. When we look at specifically now, when we look at the Middle East region, we know that Middle East region relies on labor migration for a lot of like a large component of their economy. But the tricky part here is that the Middle East region, they keep migrant workers as temporary migrant workers. There are no pathways for permanency, so there are very limited assimilation opportunities. So migrant workers are always kind of second to the natives, and there are so many issues like, you know, sometimes we have migrant workers who have been working in the same employment company for like 10 or 20 years with 1 year renewed contract. So they are not eligible for all these employment benefits or protection schemes or social security schemes. So the migrant workers in the Middle East are kind of in a vulnerable situation because of these destination specific characteristics. And then I can give another example, you know, Sri Lankan migrants to the Cyprus are in a very specific situation. Now, there is a case where Sri Lankan migrant workers have to contribute to a social security scheme in Cyprus. So their employers are also contributing. But to benefit from this social security scheme, the migrant contribution has to be there for 10 continuous years. And the employment also has to be for 10 years continuously. But then the migration modalities between Cyprus and Sri Lanka is such that a migrant worker can work only for 5 years. So no matter how much he has contributed, he can never recover the social security payment that he has done in a lawful manner. So there are so many loopholes that the migrant workers are not protected in this region. And another thing is that we know there's a huge gap in terms of accessibility or actual availability of access to healthcare or workers' protection as opposed to the official claims. Because now, if we have heard that in many cases, if a migrant worker falls ill, there's supposed to be sick leave or medical leave or insurance that they could benefit from. But in many cases, what happens is their employment contract is terminated and they don't get any benefits. So these migrant workers are vulnerable, and this didn't happen just because of this COVID-19 pandemic. This has been happening for years and years in the Middle East, and the South Asian region has been sending to the Middle East for years and years. And then what happens is when the migrant workers are in the lower end of the skills distribution, they are even more vulnerable in these countries of destination because they have limited capacity to fight for their rights, whatever rights that they might have. So it becomes very difficult for the migrant workers to handle. And during this COVID situation, we saw so many examples like the migrant workers, the construction sector migrant workers in labor camps. They've had very poor living conditions. And then social distancing was practically impossible for such migrant workers. So then they were very, very susceptible to catch the disease, and they had very little protection for themselves. The healthcare access was limited, and then social distancing was not possible. And then we have seen that, I think we've discussed before also, the previous speakers mentioned that when it comes to policies of who's being laid off, it's always the natives are protected and the migrant workers are laid off first. So in so many dimensions, migrant workers are at a disadvantage. Now, why I'm saying is that this outcome during the pandemic is sort of expected, is that we saw during the 2007-9 financial crisis also, there's literature that says that the Middle East region exported the unemployment to countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, because the moment something destabilizing happens, the Middle East region has a tendency to send the migrant workers back to their countries of origin. So there is a disproportionate responsibility between the country of origin and the country of destination. it seems as if the countries of destination are kind of getting the benefit of migrant workers while things are rosy. But the moment things start going south, then it becomes the responsibility of the country of origin. So there has to be some balance, a better balance in this. So I can give another example about the case of this amnesty granted by Kuwait during this pandemic. So it was a very noble gesture. Highly appreciate what Kuwait did. Lots of unauthorized migrant workers got amnesty to leave the country and with the possibility of coming back to Kuwait for employment later. But the problem was, in my perspective, I think Kuwait was very hasty or in such a rush to get the migrant out of the country. And despite repeated requests by the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry to test and send migrant these repatriated people under the Kuwait amnesty program, there was no such testing. So in May, when the COVID-19 pandemic was very much under control in Sri Lanka, within a week after Sri Lanka started repatriating Sri Lankans from Kuwait under this amnesty program, suddenly there was a huge spike in COVID-19 cases simply because they were not tested before coming and we didn't know they were patients. And then suddenly the entire burden of people who have already been patients in Kuwait became the burden of the country of origin or Sri Lanka. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to take this as a good opportunity to rebalance these responsibilities between the countries of origin and the countries of destination. Because as we all know, in this globalized world, with the pandemic or without the pandemic or after the pandemic, labor migration is still going to take place. And the Middle East region is heavily reliant on migrant workers, and South Asian region will continue to send a significant portion to the Middle East region. And even recently, Sri Lanka did a survey of about 4,000 repatriated migrant workers from the Middle East region. And so about 35% have mentioned that they want to go back for foreign employment, and 25% said they want to go back to the same employer. 10% said they just want to go somewhere overseas. This shows that people, even though they had to come back to Sri Lanka during this pandemic situation, even though the countries of destination didn't really take good care of them or kind of got rid of them during this difficult time, still people want to go overseas for foreign employment. So foreign employment, labor migration is here to stay. So in that context, I think it is very critical that we take this opportunity and understand that the underlying conditions is one of the main reasons that contributed to the negative outcomes that the migrant workers are facing of South Asian origin. So I think I have only about 1 minute more. So I will wrap up saying that at present, there are a couple of international frameworks that are trying to focus on improving the welfare of migrant workers, international migrant workers. One is the Sustainable Development Goals, and another is the Global Compact on Migration. So specifically the goal, the objective 16 of the GCM is about social inclusion and cohesiveness. So I think this is the time that the South Asia as a region, the sending countries have to come together, because no sending country alone can tell this message in a convincing manner to any country of origin. Sri Lanka cannot go and say this to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Qatar, saying that you have to start taking better care of our migrant workers. Then we're going to lose our competitiveness. It is the same for any South Asian country. So I think this is the time that the South Asian region as sending countries have to get together and come up with a common voice and fight for better conditions, better working conditions, better welfare conditions for our migrant workers, because this pandemic is not the first and last. There's going to be many more coming. But this has to be the teaching moment where we turn things around and make use of the existing international frameworks and strive to improve the condition for our migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Veeraratne, and for highlighting the importance of a framework for the migrants in informal sectors, especially migrants from South Asia in Gulf countries. The final speaker for today is Dr. Paras Karan from Sochi. He would be providing us a perspective from Nepal. So over to you, Dr. Karan.
Thank you, moderator. Now, as Bidisha alluded to, this was a long time coming, particularly for Nepal, given its high level of dependence on remittances and migration. Let me begin with a few facts for the benefit of the non-Nepalese among the audience. Remittances account for about at least a quarter of GDP, at least 2.8 million people working abroad. A quarter of households receive remittances from abroad. Most of those working abroad are under 40, and remittances are greater than foreign direct investment, exports of goods and services, and aid combined. And they have contributed significantly to poverty reduction as well as improvement in other socioeconomic indicators. Despite this, the viability of a development strategy that relies a lot on remittances had always been questioned by policymakers as well as researchers in Nepal. What has now happened is that vulnerability has been exposed, and what was thought of as a nightmare in terms of theoretical discussions is about to set to become a reality. So at least 800,000 are expected to return due to job losses from overseas countries. Now, these estimates vary and conflict with each other, but this is the latest estimate by the National Human Rights Commission. About 500,000 might have already returned from India due to job losses. And then there are those who would have returned anyway. You see, every day on average, 1,000 to 1,200 would have returned after completing their tenure. Now they are also stuck there abroad. However, remittances in mid-March to mid-August this year have increased slightly, about by 1% compared to last year. And it could be, as Dr. Ravi pointed out earlier, various theories are going on, are being floated around. It could be that because of distress in their home countries, remitters are remitting more. Some are also remitting their savings because they are returning home. Or there could also have been some formalization of remittances. Despite this, it would again still be premature to conclude that remittances have not been hit because the ADB remains steadfast in its projection that remittances are going to contract. As per its latest estimates, they are expected to contract by at least 28% in 2020. Plus the fact that 50% of remittances come from West Asia, or as people call it, the Middle East. And then the oil prices have to be also factored in. So the challenge facing the government or the state is surely daunting. Facilitating the return of migrants as smoothly as possible, that would be a test of the state's stated commitment to the welfare of people. Reintegrating them, plus in a way reintegrating also those who were set to go abroad, were planning to go abroad, but thanks or no thanks to COVID, they couldn't go. Then there are also those who suffered job losses in full or part, were staying home. And there was a challenge in the labor market even before COVID struck. Half of the labor force are engaged in non-paid work, mostly subsistence agriculture. I mean, wage jobs are a luxury here in the context of Nepal. And COVID has also brought into sharp light the state of governance, or rather non-governance. For example, the state should have, for example, the minimum that one expects from the state is to press into service, let's say, rescue flights promptly. That did not happen as desired. And moreover, migrants have had to pay through their nose to return. And then there are returnees from India, Nepalese who work in India, who have had to go through the agonizing wait at the border. And then migrants were also allowed to go home without due testing for some time. So the state was ill prepared for overseeing an orderly and safe return migration. So the question that has been arising is that creating jobs for them, as well as jobs for those who have been rendered unemployed or underemployed, would be an even taller order. But then the hope, however, is that this crisis will somehow galvanize it into action and put in place social protection measures that hardly exist. For example, we don't really quite have a cash transfer mechanism that flows into those unemployed. We don't have an employment guarantee program that's really effective, even before pre-COVID. Now, COVID has actually highlighted these gaps in the social protection system as well as the labor market. Now, yes, replacing migration and remittances with other sources of jobs and income may not be immediately feasible or even desirable. But when we look at the fact that the number of male wage earners, male wage workers on Nepali soil is almost equal as the number of male Nepali workers working abroad, then that indicates that there is something like fundamentally wrong with the direction of the, economy, that we haven't really been able to create jobs despite, let's say, two political changes in the last 30 years. Now, in the short term, the government in its budget has indicated that it will be focusing on public works and agriculture and forestry to create jobs, including for those who have returned. But I think a deep thinking in terms of long-term framework is also required. For example, people go abroad partly to escape agriculture. Now, the question is, why would they want to go back to agriculture except out of desperation? And then we have to look at the basics, like getting fertilizer on time is like having to pray to the gods in Nepal, although it is the duty of the state. Delivery of seeds on time, extension services properly has been weak. Now, if the state cannot provide these basics, which it was not able to provide even in the pre-COVID times, then reintegration is likely to fail. Of course, I'll be happy if I'm proven wrong. And in this context, one needs a holistic policy also. For example, what do these farmers do when they have to compete with subsidized agriculture imports? So in that case, you have to review trade agreements, including with your largest trade partner, India. And ironically, farmers, let's say, farming accounts for about 2/3 of Nepal's employed population. And you would think that farmers are a strong lobby. And yes, there are farmers' wings of political parties of different hues and stripes. But the irony is that they are not that a strong lobby. And the fact is reflected in our trade agreements and our inability to utilize even the domestic policy space that we have in those trade agreements. The point then is that reintegration strategy should be part of overall job creation strategy. And no offense meant, because I salute the migrants. They have contributed immensely to their families as well as to the macroeconomy of Nepal. But most migrants are, for want of a better word, a cog, in the machine where they work. It may be unrealistic to expect most of them to become entrepreneurs when they return home. So if anything, they want wage jobs. But remember that 60% of returnees, even before COVID, 60% of returnees were either unemployed or outside the labor force. So that must be also borne in mind, why we were not able to provide jobs earlier. So perhaps a better strategy would be to have a realistic target and then backed by evidence. For example, you set a target that we will create so many jobs, but by the end of the year, how will you know that certain number of jobs has been created? And this leads us to the data issue. We don't have a regular, at least once in a year, employment credible, comprehensive employment survey, or perhaps even more frequent than that. So what we need is not just that, but also a recording of the profile and characteristics of returning migrants, as well as those going abroad. And this may be an opportune time to achieve this also. For example, those returning from abroad are required in general by quarantine rules to be in touch with the local authorities in general. And the Local Government Operation Act mandates local bodies with the tasks of data collection on the labor market, local labor market, as well as those who have gone abroad, information dissemination with regard to locally available work, training, as well as helping returnee migration. And this must be integrated with the flagship national level Prime Minister's employment program, under which data on unemployed is already being collected. Now, in later discussion, I can jump into the issue of what industrial policy Nepal needs to generate manufacturing jobs, because manufacturing has largely bypassed Nepal, whereas manufacturing is that traditional, good old job creating sector. I'll come to that in further discussion later on. But in conclusion, political changes in the last 30 years have not delivered really jobs on the jobs front. And migration and remittances have served as a safety valve of sorts. Now, return migration might provide an opportunity in terms of exerting pressure on the government to really create jobs. right? Because otherwise you'll be feeding the so-called, in a way, the reserve army, right, of discontrolled people. It will be also a test of Nepal's nascent, federalism, in that the federalism is nascent in Nepal, but its effects so far, in my view, have mainly been in terms of increasing cost rather than delivery. Now is the time for the province and local governments to show that they have a meaning in terms of existence. It is jobs that people really care about. But if you don't utilize this opportunity, then returnee migrants, plus those rendered unemployed back home, plus those who are raring to go abroad but could not because of COVID, all these, God forbid, could constitute a veritable tinderbox that can, in a way, explode with even a small park. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paras, and especially for highlighting that how not attending the issue of returning migrants can be so critically volatile, and why the government, especially local governments, they should attend it. We have half an hour for discussion. Before I take question answers, I will request Dr. Mustafizur Rahman from Bangladesh to briefly give us the perspective from Bangladesh as well. Dr. Mustafiz, are you online?
Thank you, Abid. Thank you, Professor Srivastava and Bilesha and Radhika and Parash for a very insightful discussion. I think Abid has also, in his initial remarks, pointed out a number of very important issues. Now, as you know, remittance is also very important for Bangladesh. Last year, our remittance flow was $18 billion. In fact, that was a growth of about 11% over the previous year. So, although we had a decline during the second half of last year, but overall, the fiscal year, it was 10.9% growth. Professor Srivastava was mentioning that although there is a global decline in the remittances, but in some of the countries, we are seeing for various reasons a growth in remittances. In the first 3 months of this fiscal year, July, August, and September, we're seeing remittance growth of 50%. That's really something counterintuitive. But Professor Srivastava, I think his 3 points are very well taken. In case of Bangladesh, one added factor is that last year we have introduced 2% cash incentive for the remittance flows to the country. So that could be another additional reason. But the point that Professor Srivastava mentioned, I also think that this is not sustainable. We are seeing that because of the decline in the incomes, they are trying to send more to their households. And also there is a transfer from informality to formality because of the problems with the hawla and informal channels. But 3 points that I would like to very quickly mention is, Abid, you have very rightly mentioned about the need for appropriate data for the returning migrants. That's a major issue which we are now seeing, that we don't have the needed information in order to transfer the cash transfer, or Bangladesh has also introduced from the Expatriate Welfare Bank about 2,000 crore taka as loans. But lack of appropriate data banking is a problem. The second point I think is very important. We are talking about what our national governments are doing. But there are processes where the international host countries also have their obligations. We are not talking about the Colombo process, where the host countries and the sending countries are members. What are the rights of the migrants who are staying there? The health rights, the rights to jobs, the rights to earnings, the rights to various supports during these times of difficulties. We are not hearing about those. Bilesha mentioned about this. So I think that is also very important, that we trigger those conventions and put pressure on the host country. The third is, many of the returning migrants, they are trying to go back. Now the host countries are saying that you will have to come within 7 days, within 15 days, but the travel facilities are not in place. In Bangladesh, we are seeing in front of Saudi Arabian embassy, thousands of people, 5,000, 6,000 people They are gathering there for their visa because the visa their work permit will be expiring. So I think that that there has to be an international system in place in order for the returning migrants to go back and also to safeguard the interest of the migrant workers who are over there already. I think that these are the issues which need also some attention from the policymakers. Thank you, Abid. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Mustafizur Rahman, for adding three very important points: the need for appropriate data, host countries' responsibilities, and those who are trying to go back, how the embassies they can facilitate them. The floor is open for questions, and I would request Sati colleague who are moderating it from their side to facilitate those who would like to ask questions. We have also a couple of questions posted on chat box. One is from Bhavan Paudel, and that is about any kind of policy strategy to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on migration corridor from the countries of origin. So it is about protecting the rural economies from home countries if the remittance flow is decreasing and if the unemployment is increasing. And there is another question that was from Mustafiz. Mustafiz also pointed it out, and that is about the international obligation regarding safeguarding the interest of migrant workers in their countries during these difficult times. Professor Srivastav, if I can start with you, please, if you would like to attend any of these questions.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me now?
Please, yes, please, very loud and clear.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the, excellent presentations that have come from all the panelists. I'm looking forward to more comments by you on the Pakistani situation. You've been very strict on yourself as a moderator. I think the two issues, I think Dr. Rahman spoke, and some of the issues that he raised had already been answered also by Dr. Veeraratne. The issue of the whole question of precarity of labor markets and also the informality of labor markets in the Gulf countries. So we do look at, at governments in the Gulf countries protecting our migrant workers. But we also need to note the degree of informality that is there in those labor markets that has developed over time, and also the degree of informality that has developed in the formal parts of that economy, those economies. And that is again, like in India, the internal migrant crisis, that has made itself very manifest in the way we have seen the formal part of the Gulf economies treat the migrants. So many of them being left without wages, with a lot of cases of wage thefts, and so on. I think it's absolutely right for the source countries to repeatedly raise these issues with the destination countries, including the issues as of now, during the COVID crisis, the two additional issues are basically a visa extension till the COVID crisis is resolved, that not treating migrants as irregular migrants and access to health to them. But some of the countries, I must say that Qatar, in the face of the large amount of criticism that it faced, it has finally come up with some sensible reforms. And of the very sensible reform that it has come is that migrants can now take up employment, with other employers. And this is something which we need to, I think, as a group of source countries, probably because in the destination country, there is still a lot of demand for certain kinds of work. There are certain sectors where we see a decline and demand will not immediately come up, but there are other sectors where there is still demand. So if there is some flexibility in the type of employment that migrant workers can take up, once their visas expire or if their employment is terminated, then their conditions can be ameliorated at destination. But I do want to make a larger point that a lot of our migrants are not only migrants moving to the Gulf countries, but they're actually cross-border migrants. This is a point that we don't often discuss. Nepali migrants in India, Indian migrants in Nepal, Bangladeshi migrants in India, Indian migrants in Afghanistan, Indian migrant workers and so on and so forth. Afghan workers everywhere, including in Pakistan and Iran. So and there is also the question of our own labor markets. We have been consistently demanding better labor market conditions and labor conditions and human rights for our workers in the Gulf countries. To what extent are we prepared to extend the same conditions to workers within our own borders? Whether it's domestic workers or whether it is cross-border migrants. The issue of cross-border migrants, we simply brush under the carpet, most of the time. I think there is a general case, and we need to push the general case for rights at work of laborers and for formalization of labor markets across the board in all these countries. And I think our case, here for Sri Lanka is a little bit of an outlier because conditions in the labor market there are much better, much more formalized than in other South Asian countries. So I would like to make a case here that we need to look at labor markets more generally. And if we do that, and if we talk about rights-based approaches to labor markets in our own countries and formalizations, then we would be in a better position to advocate the same in the destination countries. But in the short term, this is a long-term issue, but in the short term, we need to have very proactive missions abroad. And we need to take up these issues both in bilateral forums and in multilateral forums. And within our own countries, we have to take a very active fiscal policy stance towards social protection, towards growth. This is extremely necessary for migrants coming back because we need to not only look at migrants coming back, and this is what I said, but at basically people out of work, underemployed in the domestic economy and create more opportunities for work. People will continue to move abroad because of demographic factors and unequal development. We can't address demographic factors in the very short term, but the patterns of unequal development which give rise to these kinds of distress kinds of migration abroad or cross-border migration certainly are things which we need to address. Thank you, Dr. Suri. It's a long answer to a short question.
Thank you. Quite comprehensive. May I take this opportunity to invite a comment from Ratnakar Adhikari. And Ratnakar, I know based in Geneva, you are also looking after the interest of LDCs, the growth and trade opportunities. One of the questions that we received was that what can be the alternative strategies for ensuring rural economies they remain intact and rural employment remains uninterrupted in case of this decrease in remittances or decrease in migration opportunities. Dr. Ratnakar Adhikari, are you with us?
Second. Oh yeah, I was not, thank you. I was not prepared. Actually, I was shooting a question to Paras, thinking out of the box and trying to look at the possibility of tapping into the opportunity of reshoring of manufacturing production in order to be able to, serve the global value chain. And then, there lies the prospects for employing the returnees who have left their country where they were working in order to come back to their country of origin. And assuming that, Paras mentioned that they are a clog in the machine or clog in the wheel, but, assuming that, they would have gained some kind of skill in the process of learning by doing, and that could potentially be applied in the manufacturing sector. So that was my question. But you asked me a different question, which is to make a rural economy productive and vibrant, if I understand it correctly, in order to observe the returnees or potentially preventing people from migrating abroad. Is that the correct way I understood the question, Abid? Okay, here is what I think.
Yes.
Well, I mean, creating jobs in the agriculture sector is critical, but agriculture alone does not support the long-term prospect of enhancing livelihood opportunities, right? So therefore, it is important for the state to pursue active industrial policy and uh, make agriculture sector rewarding for farmers by uh, creating the necessary condition for establishing business, agro-processing business in small towns and rural areas where the agriculture produce can be processed and processed into the commodities that can be stored um, uh, for a long time. I'll just give you one example which might be of help here, and based on what we've done in a country such as Mali. So Mali was involved in production of mango. We provided them support to produce mango, and they were able to produce tons of mangoes, but there was a glut in the market. They were unable to export. Then they thought that it would be prudent for them to establish agro-processing plant, for which we got in touch with the government of Netherlands and provided them support to establish a factory for the processing of mango into mango jams and dried mango. So once the factory was established, the processing was done, and the necessary certification was provided, necessary SPS training, good agriculture practices, and good manufacturing practices training was provided. They were able to export mango jam and dried mango to European market. And as we speak, they are still exporting to countries such as Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. So this could be one way of helping the country through development assistance channel. But then nobody is going to prevent the state from doing so, or nobody is going to prevent private sector from doing so, so that people can utilize the raw material that they have to add value and be able to trade internationally. I hope I was able to respond to your question.
Thank you, Ratnakar. Any other question on chat? Any of the participants, if you like to ask any question live?
Can I make a comment?
Yes, please. I was coming to you.
So I think there was one mention about what can be done to safeguard migrant workers. So I think there are like two processes that came out of this COVID pandemic. One is called the Initiative to Develop an International Justice Mechanism for repatriated migrant workers to address their issues on wages and other outstanding claims in a systematic way. So some of these migrant organizations, civil society organizations, international organizations are coming together to kind of to demand or to create an international framework where the repatriated migrant workers can, still claim their unpaid wages or unpaid dues. So I think that is something that you all were hinting in one way or the other, that some protective mechanism. And another is this Swiss and UK call for remittances, to keep remittances flowing. So these two initiatives have kind of popped out of the situation of this whole COVID-19 pandemic, that they have not got too much traction as far as I know, but the idea has emerged. So hopefully it will grow over time and it will become something fruitful.
Thank you. And Dr. Radhika, if I can come to you, if you wear your former ILO hat, one of the points that is being highlighted again and again, and that is the responsibility of host countries to provide some social safety net or social protection to those migrant laborers. Was ILO or is ILO mindful of this aspect? I know you can't respond on behalf of ILO anymore, but from your experience, would you like to add anything?
Well, if you actually look at the ILO's Global Commission report on the future of work that came out last year, it actually raises this issue. It talks about the idea of, a universal labor guarantee and universal social security cover for all. And this essentially comes from the fact that large proportions of the workforce, in particular in developing economies, are in informal work arrangements. And as we are seeing changes in the world of work, where we are seeing the emergence of the gig economy, the platform economy, we are seeing new forms of informalization. So as old forms of informality persist, there are new forms of informality which are also emerging. And in this scenario, there is a need for basically assuring that all workers, regardless of what their contractual status is, where they are located, what the host country is, and what the home country is, I mean, there should be universal social security cover and there should be universal labor guarantee. Of course, there are questions about how that is going to be funded. I mean, in the context of India in particular, I mean, one of the big learnings of this crisis has been that, the fact that we don't have portability of various social security entitlements is a big problem. We've seen that in the case of the public distribution system, where people are trying to access the rations, that the free rations that the government had in fact made available. But several people were not able to access it, even when they had their ration cards, they were not able to access the free ration where they were located. Similarly, there was cash transfers which were allowed for construction workers who were registered with the Board of Construction Workers. But very often, construction workers, which are a large part of the circular migrants, there was a question about where they could access those benefits, because they might have been registered in one state but working in another state. So the question of portability of benefits, be it within a nation or across nations, is of course something which we have to look at very seriously when we face a shock like this. And we're better prepared. I mean, for if there were to be an exogenous shock that concomitantly hits the world, not just a part of the globe.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. Any last words from Paras?
Thank you. So I'll just briefly respond to Dr. Adhikari's comment about tapping into opportunity of reshoring. Yes, I think opportunity exists in the medium term and beyond. But then there's also tremendous competition in it because Nepal has not been able to integrate itself into export-oriented global supply value chains in the first place. And now with COVID, there are talks about reshoring of such chains and diversification away from, let's say, China. But there are already other countries, including Bangladesh, for example, which is an LDC, but a manufacturing powerhouse, compared to Nepal. These countries are also vying for the same investment. So that will be challenging, but the opportunity is there. And in this context, focusing on agro-processing industry could be a way ahead. And when I said that these returnee migrants are a cog in the machine, what I mentioned was that it's not that they do not have any skills as such, but when they come back, as I pointed out earlier, they want wage jobs. And this is where industrial policy kicks in. And what Dr. Adhikari mentioned also kicks in. So what we need to do at the basic level is that to have a profile of these returnee migrants. And I cannot tell you exact figure from the top of my head, but there is evidence that at least migrants from Malaysia, Nepalese migrants coming from Malaysia in the past, significant portion of them have worked in the manufacturing sector. And Malaysia is significantly integrated into global supply chains. So what we need to do is map their characteristics, do their profiling, and match them with existing industrialists also, and then revisit why exactly we have not been able to participate in global value chains in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paras. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure You must have enjoyed the webinar as much I enjoyed and learned. I won't try to summarize the discussion, but what I can say that we in South Asia, the home countries, sending our migrants, cross-border migration, and the host countries, would take the migrant workers for granted. We have been taking them for granted unless this COVID hit us. And the same we were doing for internal migrants who were serving and providing their services within their home countries. We need to change this attitude at policy level, not to take them for granted. If in many of the countries, if the share of remittances is higher than the net foreign direct investment, and in case of Pakistan, for example, if we're receiving $28 billion per annum without any strings attached, and then for $6 billion IMF loan, we have to fulfill a lot of conditionalities. So I think we need to give value to the migrant workers, appreciate them, and also we need to press upon the host countries for fulfilling the obligations. Dr. Kapoor mentioned the ILO report. Of course, this decent employment and decent work conditions, those are important. And the countries who are running the bread and butter in Middle Eastern economy, the South Asian countries, I think our governments and our embassies, they need to play a more proactive role to ensure and to safeguard the interest of our migrant workers. I'll stop here and I'll ask the SOTI colleagues to conclude this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Suleri, for so expertly moderating this event. I would like to apologize for the lack of video on my part. There has been some technical problem here. But thank you, Dr. Abid Suleri, so much. And special thanks goes to our keynote speaker, Professor Ravi Srivastava, who made such insightful keynote speech here. And Sauti and the other co-organizers are also extremely grateful to the speakers, Dr. Radhika Kapoor, Dr. Bilesa Wiraratne, and Dr. Paras Khorel for their expert and fine analysis on the discussion today. And of course, we would like to thank the participants for making this a very lively and insightful discussion. And before we depart today, I hope that you would join us again on Friday, October 9, for yet another webinar, which will discuss on the impact of COVID-19 on tourism and revival strategies of South Asian countries. Saying that, I would like to thank you all once again and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And for tea, coffee, please go to your kitchens and get your own tea and have it.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you, Dr. Suleri.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues.
See you, Abid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Abid.
you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, brother. Posh.
Yeah, thank you.
Posh, you scare me.
Really?
Bilesha, how are you?
Good,